Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Max and I'm from West Virginia, which is the southernmost northern state and the northernmost southern state. Our state is often referred to as the mountain state, and rightly so, given it is the only USA state to lie completely within the tree-covered mountain range of the Appalachian Mountains. West Virginia borders Pennsylvania on the north, Virginia to the east, and Kentucky to the southwest. I personally would describe the summers here as hot and humid, with crisp, mild winters and occasional snowfall. I'm from the very picturesque historic area of Ansborough, where I grew up and still currently reside with my wife and 2 kids in one of those stately historic red brick homes that date back to the 1800s. I live in a very picturesque leafy green street lined with palmetto and oak trees and in close proximity to southern restaurants, bakeries and quirky coffee shops. I grew up as an only child of strict, very rigid parents who procured full-time, stodgy and mundane jobs in downtown Charleston in the business sector. This invariably meant that during the school holidays I would have the luxury of spending copious amounts of time on my affluent uncle's West Virginian farm with 3 cousins all of a similar age to myself. Thankfully, my draconian, rather stiff parents believed it was salient for me to spend time with other youngsters my own age. And so growing up, I considered my cousins to be like my own brothers, and my uncle to be like a second father to me, or the fun-loving father, rather, that I never had. As a young boy, I engaged in clay pigeon shooting with my cousins on their farm, which was only a little light-hearted fun for all of us, but that was when my uncle became vigilantly aware of my prodigious, phenomenal ability to shoot on target. One day when I was playing darts with my cousins, my uncle was so astounded that I almost got the bullseye every single time. I remember him saying, "Son, you remind me of an eagle. You're dead on target every time, with a very keen eye and a steady hand. You have a rare gift, my son. One day you'll make a fine hunter or a marksman." One day my uncle decided to introduce me to a man that was considered one of Virginia's finest hunters. I remember that my uncle said to him, "Clay, I think you need to take a look at this young man. You should take him under your wing. He has the makings of a very fine, formidable hunter. I think you'll be very impressed with this young man when you see how he performs." Clay took me under his wing like a mother hen, and we became firm friends with a huge passion for hunting, and it felt good to shoot animals so skillfully that they didn't suffer as death was immediate. Clay professed that I reminded him of himself in his younger days. He introduced me to target practice and told me that I was a natural talent and had excellent composure, self-control and trigger awareness. He believed I had the makings of an accomplished, consummate and polished marksman. I was told and informed by many people that if I was in the army, I would receive what they call the expert badge, because I could hit more than 36 out of 40 targets with masterful skill and expertise. I wasn't interested in going to the army by any means, but was desirous in enjoying hunting just for sport, which is something that I did throughout my young life, growing up under the artful and adroit guidance and instruction of Clay himself. where it was not long before I established an ingenious reputation for being a fine shot. You might expect me to work with rifles or in a shooting range or for a security company or to have joined the military, but you would be wrong, as my full-time profession is in fact an architect in Charleston, designing homes for people. I enjoy the challenge of creating, planning and designing homes for the discerning homeowner with an eye for something classical with old-world charm, which is my forte. I follow my passion always, as I have no interest in building modern developments, as for me they seem so sterile, parochial, insular and pedestrian. I often spend weekends hunting or teaching target practice at a local shooting range, but it seems that people have very long memories in regards to my virtuoso ability with firearms, which is why I have two extraordinary stories to share with you and your listeners that will quite literally knock your socks off and amaze you. Even today I look back and reflect and say to myself, did that really happen to me? But I assure you most certainly that it did. My first story begins when a local Charleston man contacted me and arranged a rendezvous in a bar that specialises in craft beers for an important chat, which I was told was highly secret and a matter of strict importance. I remember after we drank a couple of beers, he handed me a huge wad of cash in a brown envelope and casually asked me to murder his wife in such a nonchalant way as if he was asking me if I would like tomato ketchup with my fries. I remember being astonished by such a preposterous, outlandish request, and the man assured me that he had established that I was a first-class shot with a firearm. I just don't want to hire someone for this job who might misfire and cause grievous bodily harm or undue suffering. I don't want my wife to suffer, he told me. It must be an instantaneous death. As you can imagine, I was horrified that someone wanted to hire me for such nefarious, heinous intentions, and I asked this man why he wanted to kill his wife. I was not prepared for his unfathomable answer, nor the enigmatic way in which he reacted to my question. For at first the man seemed stoic and calm, and then quite suddenly, like the sudden unexpected rain shower on a clear day, he began to cry hysterically, failing to compose himself as he tried valiantly to fight back the tears. I have never seen a man so broken and discomposed in all my life, and I was aware that given his reserve and stiff upper lip, he was not predisposed to emotional outbursts of any kind. I sensed he felt really rather embarrassed and ashamed. I watched the man fiddling awkwardly with his drink, fixing his eyes upon the glass, and then he spoke. "My manic wife is not right in the head," he told me. "I live with a demented woman who violently assaults me every single day of my life. One moment she's as gentle as a doe, and the next minute she flies off the handle and becomes like a raging lunatic, growling and gnawing at me, much like a rabid dog. It's like she becomes blazingly savage and demonical." I noted he looked awkward telling me this, and he shrugged uncomfortably as he continued. "She viciously lashes out at me in pugnacious, crazed frenzy, sometimes even assaulting me by throwing knives at me. She beats me up with anything she can lay her hands on, and then laughs and cackles like a witch, as if she takes pleasure in my suffering. When I get home, I have to walk on eggshells every day of my life, because anything I might say will set her off. And if that isn't bad enough, she lashes out at me with the foulest, most obscene language that is dirty, filthy, offensive, slanderous and cursory. Yet there is a tender, nurturing side of her, the side that I love, the warm-hearted side that I knew when we first got married. I regret to admit that side is dying more and more every day, as the manic side overtakes the good side. It's a little like seeing a beautiful rose wither away in front of you, dying, and you're only left with the jagged thorns. She's no longer the woman I fell in love with. It's like the woman has died." "Well, why don't you get a divorce and walk away? That's the simple, most practical solution, surely," I said. "It's not killing your wife. That's rather an extreme course of action to take in this regard." "It's not as simple as that," said the man. "You see, my wife is not mentally well, and is very unstable. I don't think she would contend on her own. I've been to countless doctors, and she's been on hundreds of medications, but nothing has worked. I've sent her for hundreds of tests and psychological evaluations, and I've been told there's nothing wrong with her, and that she's mentally sound. I've reached the end of my tether, and we're at a loss as what to do about our precarious predicament. Let me tell you that." "We?" I asked, looking stupefied. "Are you telling me that your wife knows all about this? Is that what you're saying?" "Oh, yes. She's most keen on me hiring you. In fact, she was the one that sought you out. She has no control over herself when she becomes this deranged. She tries everything she can to suppress it, but nothing helps. She says that she's so overcome with this maniacal desire to kill me. And she wants it so badly. She doesn't know if she's going to be able to stop herself. It's like something perfidiously evil takes over her body. She says she wants this guileful malaise that's growing inside her like a rampant aggressive cancer gone for good. We've come to the shameful conclusion together that this is the only way to end this, with a shot to the head. It's not something I want at all, but my wife is insistent upon it. She says that she needs to go because she can't believe what she is becoming. And I'm inclined to agree. Enough is enough, because this is not my wife anymore." "Look," I said, "I really think you're asking the wrong person to help you. I also would never assist anyone to kill their own wife, as it's not, in my opinion, ethical, even in extreme circumstances like yours. I'm not a sniper, but I do think I may know what your stumbling block may be." "You do," said the man, looking perturbed. "Have you heard of demonic possession?" I asked. "You think my wife has a demon?" said the man, looking startled, as if he'd never even considered the thought. "Well, it's a possibility," I said. "Try and think about when her behaviour began to change. Can you connect it to anything insidious that might originate towards something demonic that could somehow be connected to your wife's current behaviour? Something that happened, perhaps, that made her suddenly change." "Like what?" asked the man. "Well, like a random visit to a graveyard, or playing the Ouija board. Anything like that." "Well, I do remember she brought an antique mirror at a yard sale once, and became very fixated about it. She swore to me she could see her dead mother in the mirror, staring back at her. It made her very happy indeed, because her mother died a long time ago and she misses her very much." "Well, maybe it was not her mother in the mirror," I said. "Maybe it was something demonic that has overpowered and deceived her. If I were you, I would try and get hold of an exorcist. I'm no expert in these matters, but believe me, you don't want to hire a sniper to kill your wife. That's not the answer to your problems. And I'm going to pretend you never asked me to do this for you." I said this, getting up and leaving the table. The man looked heartily relieved, and I never heard from him for an entire year. He then contacted me to inform me that an exorcist had indeed been called to their property over 2 months ago, and he claimed that his wife was indeed possessed. I was so relieved to find someone who might be able to help us, he told me over the phone. I felt as if a weight had been lifted off me, and this exorcist knew exactly what he was doing. It was exactly like the movies. My wife was foaming at the mouth and speaking in Latin, in a haughty, pompous man's voice. That was definitely not her own. I noticed her eyes were rolling in the back of her head. It was like her face began to change in front of my eyes, and she was laughing and spitting at the exorcist. We had to tie her down, because during the exorcism she exhibited the strength of 5 men, and she was wrestling and lashing out at us angrily. I have never seen anything like it before. She didn't levitate like you see in the movies, but I could see that she was possessed by something very evil. It turned out that this demon gained possession over her through that antique mirror, which was some kind of a portal, I gather. The demon was pretending to be her mother, to lure her in, so to speak. We found out she was possessed by Abaddon, which apparently is the destroyer, which is exactly what was happening to our marriage. My wife has been delivered. She's a new woman, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, because my life and our lives have changed, and I have the woman I love back, and life is just wonderful. I'm so glad to hear it, I told him, and I'm pleased to have been of help. My second rather strange story begins when the same thing happened to me all over again. Well, not quite. I was informed to meet a farmer in a bar in Charleston. We ordered a few craft beers between us and talked a little about the weather, with all the normal social niceties you usually go through. Finally, he pulled out a large envelope of cash, and I remember thinking, please God, no, not again. I gather you're an excellent shot, said the man. I need someone who cannot miss. I don't trust myself for the job, because it won't be easy. I can't kill your wife, sir, or anybody else for that matter, I piped quickly. I just can't do it. I'm very sorry, and whatever it is, I don't want to know or get involved. Please just don't tell me. I need you to kill a Bigfoot on my farm, blurted the farmer. A Bigfoot, I asked, looking agog. Are you kidding me or what? Yes, a Bigfoot. It's causing all kinds of problems on our farm. He has killed chickens and pigs just for sport, and caused all kinds of upset on our farm. He terrorizes everyone, including my poor wife. I think our lives are in grievous danger, and this capricious Bigfoot is a very dangerous and volatile creature. Look, sir, I said, how can you be absolutely sure it's a Bigfoot that's giving you all this grief? I'm not even sure I actually believe they exist. I don't see how I could possibly help you in this matter. I've had the problem before, said the man. The military came along to my farm and killed 4 Bigfoots and evacuated the bodies in the dead of night in a huge army van. Well, why don't you call the military again, I asked. Why are you calling me? The man looked at me soberly. I will never call the military ever again, because they were unscrupulous. I think they're under the impression that every single Bigfoot should be obliterated. When they visited my farm, they killed all the Bigfoot at random. And they're not all bad. Some of the Bigfoot are very good indeed, with feelings and emotions, just like people. Killing the good ones would be tantamount to murder in my book. We have Bigfoots on our land that have helped us over the years. One rescued one of my dogs from a mountain lion once, and my cat from drowning. Another brought my wife back to the house after she broke her leg and couldn't walk. How could I ever harm those creatures after they helped us? That would be morally reprehensible in my book. Now can you see my quandary? He continued, We have one very unstable, iniquitous Bigfoot on our land that is exceedingly evil. He's the one I need you to kill. He's the one disturbing the peace and upsetting everybody. He's the one that goes after the livestock, while the other Bigfoots respect it. He's the problem. Why should the other Bigfoot die on his account? Even they are frightened of him. He's a monster, if ever I saw one. Well, supposing I do help you, I said, and that is a very big supposing, how am I going to determine which Bigfoot is which? How am I going to know which one to kill? I imagine they all must look exactly the same. How on earth am I going to distinguish one from the other? You will know, said the farmer. Believe me, you will know. Look at the eyes, and you will know. If you have your mark, that's how you will tell. It's that simple. I need someone who will not miss because this animal is exceedingly dangerous. And if you shoot him and miss, you are pretty much dead, because he will throttle you before you can even get to firing again. Look, I said, I'm not taking your money now, and I'm not doing this for money either. I'm going to scout your land first, to see if I do encounter the Bigfoot that you describe. If I do sense he's dangerous to you and your family, then I will indeed kill him. But I'm not making any promises about anything at this stage, and that is something I want to assure you. The farmer looked heartily relieved. I'll make it worth your while, he assured me. So there I was on a Saturday afternoon, armed with my suitcases that I'd packed for an entire week, and my high-caliber rifle. I was driving towards the West Virginian farm and mulling over my plans in my head to scout for Bigfoot, and I really wasn't sure what to think about this dubious matter. You see, I've never believed in the mythical, erroneous creature like Bigfoot before, and it seemed as anomalous and far-fetched to me as if I'd been asked to take down a unicorn. Yet curiosity had got the better of me, and I was interested and intrigued about the mission I had in hand. I did want to help the troubled farmer, of course, and his frightened family, and if I could protect them from the dangerous critter, I would. He clearly had become an impending and certain threat to their lives, yet it was really not that simple as looking into the eyes of a critter to discern whether I had my mark. Surely not. My mother had always told me, though, that eyes were indeed the window of the soul. Maybe she was right, I thought. Before long I found myself driving my jeep down a long gravel white road until I came to an open gate with a sign which read Birchwood Farm. I cautiously proceeded down the long driveway, surrounded by lush emerald green valleys and undulating hills, covered in sumptuous verdant forests and pretty open prairies that were lined with white pole fencing, where beautiful brown and white dappled horses were grazing in the fields. There were pretty whimsical barns dotted here and there, and the occasional silvery pond. It was all incredibly pretty and enticing, and so idyllic and pastoral that it quite literally took my breath away. Yet I perceived that this farm was vast, mountainous, and exceedingly forested. It could be like looking for a needle in a haystack, trying to locate the elusive, evasive, and obscure Bigfoot here. I was certainly going to require my tracking experience to help me navigate my way around the terrain. I drove up to an L-shaped driveway where nestled in an open clearing was a very stunning 1800s red-brick farmhouse that had the same kind of historic integrity and charm as my own home in Charleston, only on a much grander scale, of course. It was surrounded by large white wooden sash windows and a very sizable white front door. It was the kind of architecture I cherished and valued greatly. A somewhat portly, round-faced, cheerful woman called Maple came dashing out of the house to greet me, and she grabbed my suitcases for me and led me into a lavish, immaculate bedroom that overlooked the most spectacular views of the countryside. "You'll be staying in here," she informed me, "and let me know if there's anything you need." She continued, "Oh, I'm so glad you've come. We really need your help. We're desperate to resolve this dreadful problem of ours." In short, this warm-hearted, gregarious and fun-loving family welcomed me into their cosy home and were welcoming, humorous and congenial. I was to learn that they had developed and established a long generational relationship with Bigfoot on their land over many years. I was informed that there were different Bigfoot clans, some good and others bad, all over North America, which pretty much predetermined what kind of an encounter you would have if the hairy critter crossed your path. "They're not that different to us," Maple explained. "You get bad people and you get good people. In our society we lock away the bad ones, but the military seem to think that all Bigfoots are bad, which is definitely not the case at all. Bigfoot tend to come in clans. The bad clans will kill anything and anyone," Maple told me, "and especially other Bigfoot that they consider to be their rivals. We have one of those Bigfoots on our land, and he terrorizes my family and kills my livestock and murders other Bigfoots. He's a nasty piece of work, you better believe it, and that monster does not have a soul. He has a heart of pure evil." The very next day I began my scouting over this vast expanse of verdant forest and rocky terrain, full of obscure paths, boulders, rocky outcrops, cliffs and meandering streams. I navigated my way through these woods, looking for signs that most people might miss, but it took me 3 long days to find my first sign of any Bigfoot activity. I remember I found my first Bigfoot track on the muddy silt beside the edge of a stream on the south side of the property. I knew I was getting somewhere, as the sizable footprint was so incredibly fresh. It was only made 20 minutes ago. That at least is what I assumed. It least measured about 18 inches. As I stood there I detected a faint odour. Nothing very strong, but a smell that reminded me of a wet dog with a musty essence to it that you often find in zoo enclosures. All of a sudden, in no uncertain terms, I knew I was being watched, and I was being studied, and my sharp discerning eye suddenly caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. That was when I saw her. The very large creature was hiding behind a curtain of shrubbery, and peeping at me curiously. When she knew I had spotted her, she began to reveal herself to me. I noticed her deep-set dark chocolate eyes twinkled with mischief and humour, but they were also pinned very deliberately on my rifle. I could discern she knew exactly what my rifle was, but she didn't seem unduly concerned about her own personal safety. On the contrary, she began to chatter excitedly in a high-pitched tone that sounded rather like the Chinese language. She then beckoned for me to follow her, which I did. I knew by her demeanour that she was not my mark. Everything about this critter was very convivial and cheery. I cautiously followed her, and that was when she indicated for me to be very, very quiet and to hide behind this large maple tree, and that is exactly what I did. And that was when I saw them. It was very hard to tell them apart, as they were so Herculean in size. Words fail me to describe how massive these creatures were. They were easily over 8 foot tall, 3 foot wide, and about 800 pounds, and all I could see at this point were layers of long dark hair that were so black it could have almost been blue. I just saw huge muscle mass moving beneath the layers of long hair. All I could hear was growling and grunting, and one of these creatures was trying to throttle the other one, but they were engaged in a huge brawl. and it was so difficult to determine which one of these massive beasts was in fact the murderous one, or my mark, so to speak. This was even more problematic than I had ever anticipated. I could see these two Bigfoots wanted to kill each other, and they were lashing out viciously with long series of violent punches, wallops and thumps, and it was far from pretty. I decided to throw a little pebble at the critter that was straddling the Bigfoot that was crushed beneath his very hefty tree-trunk-sized thighs. My pebble landed perfectly upon his shoulder, and the critter looked up for a moment, and in that second I did not discern any duplicity or evil intent in his eyes. On the contrary, I noted that he looked exhausted, weary, and exceedingly overwhelmed. I perceived that he just about had as much as he could possibly take of all this incessant fighting. Yet it would seem he had no choice in the matter, as he had to defend himself and his family. In that second, the brief distraction of the pebble caused the Bigfoot to loosen his grip on his sizable, hefty opponent. Suddenly his rival bounced from the floor, rising up like the head of a giant anaconda, ready to strike. This formidable foe began to lunge towards the other critter, and pulled back his lips to unleash the most horrifying growl that I have ever heard. Indeed, it was so dreadful it made my skin crawl, and my body break out into a cold sweat. I began to look through my scope at the critter, who turned for a brief moment to look in my direction, and that was when I saw his eyes. Oh, my word, my client was right. Never in all my born days have I observed such evil as I saw in those eyes. It was like I was staring at the devil himself, or one of his devoted followers who helped him stoke up the very flames of hell to make it significantly hotter, to cause as much grievous pain and suffering as possible for anyone caught up in the flames. In that second I knew I had found my mark, and I quickly unleashed a bullet, hitting him directly in the head, and he dropped to the ground dead, and it was finally all over. All became suddenly very silent and still, and it seemed like for a moment everything became deathly quiet. And then suddenly I heard leaves rustling, and I saw trees swaying backwards and forwards, and I heard bipedal feet running towards the corpse. And then I saw 5 Bigfoot gathered together, with long black flowing hair and cone-shaped heads, and they began to dance jubilantly around the dead corpse, and they made whooping sounds. The critters were ecstatic, but the big male who'd been fighting his vindictive opponent looked as if the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. I've never seen anyone look more heartily relieved than he did. I began to walk away, feeling mollified and reassured that it was all finally over. But I turned around to see the female that I'd noticed earlier. She was handing me a blue feather, the most beautiful blue feather that I've ever beheld. And for a moment our eyes met, and I could feel this immense warmth fill my entire body, as I sensed the depths of her gratitude. Then she turned around and just glided away with such a seamless grace. I was blown away. Fast forward an entire month, and I learnt from the farmer and his entire family that the happy whooping sounds were heard all over the valley for an entire month after the critter's death. I gather that despite their differences, the critters had buried the body of the aggressive male bully. They said everyone was happy at the farm, and they were having no more problems with livestock being killed, and even their 2 anxious dogs were no longer afraid, and the horses were so much calmer and more content. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Martina, and I'm from Denver in Colorado, which is situated on the high plains of the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. My ancestors emigrated to Denver from Mexico in the 1900s, along the routes of the old railway lines, and we have lived here ever since and never looked back. My family still upholds many of our traditions and embraces our ancient culture, along with our long drawn-out love affair with the chili pepper that brings to life some of our famous traditional dishes, from chili con carne to tacos, salsas, wraps, and so many other dishes with names you may find difficult to pronounce if you're not Mexican, so I'll save you the bother. My strange incredulous story that ultimately led to my anomalous Bigfoot encounter happened in 2015, when I was 18 years old at the time. It all began when my mother and I rented out a small apartment in Snowmass Village during the winter months, which is about 15 minutes commute to Aspen. For the both of us, this was a quintessential opportunity to raise more money for our ever-increasing family, as now both my 2 older cousins were expecting babies in the spring. We had been recruited for a cleaning job which involved housekeeping and straightening up some luxury cabins hired by wealthy, affluent people. These are regular, opulent, prosperous visitors who tend to frequent Aspen during the winter months to embrace the fabulous, arresting and indelible skiing opportunities and, of course, other exhilarating experiences Aspen has to offer, of which there are many, including fabulous fine dining, high-end shopping at some of the most exquisite boutiques you've ever seen, or driving to Independence Pass, or even visiting a ghost town. Believe me, there is so much to do in this part of the world, which is steeped in a vibrant, rich cultural history and is blessed with an idyllic setting and a perfect climate. It's difficult to leave Aspen without being touched magically in some way by the place, as it is a very profound, memorable way of rubbing off on you, as it is such a spectacularly awesome place. Aspen is nestled in the heart of the Rocky Mountains at 8,000 feet, so you'll find snow in Aspen half the year round. Hence the reason that you'll also find 4 ski resorts there. Words fail me to describe to you how breathtakingly beautiful it is in this part of the world, and the winters are dramatic, wondrous and awe-inspiring, and the views of the majestic Maroon Bells, the most photographed peaks in North America, are utterly stupendous. I was born and raised in Denver and grew up here with the rest of my extended family in what I can only describe as a modest, very bog-standard looking home, but it served our most immediate needs, and it still does, although space was in scant supply, and our tiny yard leaves much to be desired. But we're fortunate enough to live next to green parks, hiking trails, and vast open spaces, so I can't really complain about all of that. I live under the confines of one roof with my aunt's family, along with her 4 children, and my parents, along with 6 of my rather rambunctious, noisy younger sisters and brothers. So as you can imagine, it's a tight squeeze for all of us, but a very jovial, happy household nevertheless, which I wouldn't change for the world. Growing up as a young girl in Denver, life was never easy for me, and for many long years my life was incongruously cloaked with a dark veil of desperate unhappiness, which was exceedingly strange, because I had nothing to be sad about, as love was never in short supply in our household. Yet I felt this ineffable, deep-rooted sadness that was so distressing and soul-destroying for me, that I would seek relief from my tortured state by cutting myself. I know it sounds incredibly crazy and incongruous to the uninitiated, but it would seem that when I cut myself with a sharp blade and watched the bright crimson-red blood gushing out of my wound, I would feel this incredible sense of relief. It was like I could breathe again. It all made me feel alive inside my heart that always seemed to feel so dead, lifeless and empty, almost as if my life was devoid of any purpose or meaning. Before long I had so many scars on my arms and legs from all my cutting. I was deeply ashamed of this deep, dark, insidious secret that I kept well hidden from my family under emotional lock and key. A skeleton in my cupboard that I hoped would never ever be uncovered. That was until one fateful day when I forgot to lock the bathroom door behind me. That was when my mother walked in on me, catching me in the act of cutting myself, and she nearly did her nut. I've never seen her so distraught or dismayed in all my life. The expression on her face I will never forget. She was mortified. I remember her grabbing my blade from me and screaming, "What on earth are you doing to yourself, girl?" My mother immediately sent me to a top psychologist and worked double shifts to pay for my extremely expensive medical bills. And that was when I ultimately received all the psychological help, guidance and evaluations that I actually needed, that changed my life dramatically, so much for the better. I was to learn that the root cause of my inscrutable distress and enigmatic grief was due to the very fact that I was part of an identical twin. A year after our births, my twin sister Emma died of SIDS at 1 year of age. Both my parents kept this fact a classified secret from me. They falsely assumed it was best that I was never informed about her, as it could potentially cause me anguish and heartbreak. Growing up, I'd sensed that something intrinsically wrong and ambiguous was missing from my life, which was why I was so unhinged and deeply troubled. Once I discovered that I was part of a twin, it explained away the hollow vacuum that had compounded my life for so very long. I began to heal remarkably quickly, and I felt as light and as free as a butterfly that was emerging from a cocoon to embrace a bright, cheerful and happy world. I ascertained that on a deeply subliminal level I had clearly missed my twins' absence in my life. At last the perplexing, indecipherable mystery had been brought out into the light of day, and the dark clouds had dissipated like the vapour from a steaming kettle. It was wonderful to be alive, and for the very first time in ages, I was extremely happy. My psychologist informed me that cutting is indeed a secret condition suffered by many in deep silence, and used as a coping mechanism around the world, much like some people might use drugs, foods, alcohol, or even cigarettes, to cope with something very stressful, and that did make me feel a lot better about what I'd done. We had never been a wealthy family by any manner of means, but we've always been a devoted, close and loving one. We've often struggled to get by financially because things can get tight from time to time, with so many hungry mouths to feed. This is why my mother and I accepted the job to come up to Aspen to make extra money during the winter season. We were assured by our employers that the job was really worthwhile, as some of these affluent families do tip very generously, and it was an added incentive for us over and above our pay packet. Well, that's what they told us anyway. My incredulous story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened in 2015, when my mother and I had been recruited as a joint team to clean out 2 cabins together, one that was the furthest away on the resort, flanked by a heavily wooded area of exquisitely beautiful quaking aspen trees with shimmering foliage and big-toothed aspens that during winter are cloaked with veils of white snow that hang from the trees like ethereal ice crystals and are really exquisite. We had spent the first 2 days in Aspen being fully trained by a member of staff on how to ensure that we turned out the cabins meticulously and that there was no dust anywhere. So began our cleaning adventure, and it most certainly was exactly that. It was also an education and an eye-opening experience to see how the other half live, when money has never been an issue in their lives. In all my life, I've never seen so many designer handbags, shoes, expensive clothes and luxury perfumes and makeups. But at the end of the day, that is all they were, just things. And I soon realised that with or without money, they really were not much different to any of us. One day as my mother and I were making the bed in one of the cabins, in my peripheral vision, I was certain I'd seen something standing at the window, looking in at us with a nose smudged against the pane. I looked up for a brief moment, and I saw this very large face and these big, soulful, dark, curious eyes studying us. This was the window that was situated only yards away from the densely forested area of quaking aspen. It happened so quickly. 1 minute he was there, and then he was gone. And sometimes when things happen that fast, you begin to perceive that you must have imagined things. I was almost sure that I had. "Did you see that, Mum?" I asked. "Did I see what?" she asked. "That strange face staring at us through the window. It was black and hairy." "Oh, it was probably a bear," said my mother. "I don't think it was a bear," I told her. "It was something else." I remember that day with crystal clear clarity, as for over 2 weeks of cleaning this particular cabin, an area of the bathroom floor close to the toilet seat had been wiped down scantily, failing to conceal the telltale trails of bloody residue that looked ominously like the crime scene after I cut myself in secret when I was going through such a challenging, tumultuous, turbulent time in my own life. I also noticed a tight knotted plastic bag hidden in the bathroom bin. Every day for 2 whole weeks I had discovered it was full of tissues covered in blood. I immediately suspected that one of our guests was a secret cutter like I had been, and this was confirmed when I saw some blood-covered blades hidden in the lady's bedside table, along with lots of plasters and bandages. It was a scene that haunted me and brought back so many horrific, horrible memories of a time when I began cutting myself. I was so certain that this lady was suffering as much heartache as I had been, and I wanted more than anything in the entire world to help her. I knew that she was stinking rich, and I was exceedingly poor, but in the huge scheme of things, we weren't really much different between each other. I wrestled with my conscience. Should I pretend not to have seen what I had already discerned? Would it not be like walking past someone collapsing in a supermarket and doing nothing to help them? It seemed so morally wrong to me. I had no idea what I should do. It really was a conundrum. "Look, Mum," I said, showing her the bloody blades. "I think we have a secret cutter here. I wish I could help her." "Darling, it's none of our business. We're only here to clean, not to interfere in other people's lives. We could potentially lose our jobs if we began meddling in other people's affairs. And believe me, darling, they would not thank us for it either. No one likes their secrets being brought out into the light for everyone to see and to judge. You didn't." I knew I could never get my mother to understand the true gravity of the problem. She did not relate or even conceive the hopeless despair that I went through that time that I was cutting myself for so many years, and how tortuous it had been for me. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing to help, but I had no idea what course of action to take, so I prayed about it earnestly, asking for guidance and direction. I even asked God for a sign. Should I intervene or not? Show me whether I should or shouldn't. It was as if a door had suddenly been opened for me to play my part in this unfolding drama. For later that afternoon I was asked by one of the managers if I could stay on a little longer, as a recently vacated cabin needed cleaning for the guests that were arriving the following morning. He had chosen me and not anybody else. "I know it's late in the day," he said, "but the cleaner has suddenly taken ill, and I need this job done pronto." "I'll do it," I said, telling my mother to go back to Snowmass, and I would return later that evening. After the cleaning job was finally completed and I was satisfied that the cabin was indeed presentable, I ambled casually towards the cabin that I'd been cleaning earlier on in the morning. I decided that the best course of action to take was to talk to the lady's husband in private. I would tell him what I'd uncovered about his wife. I knew I risked losing my job for interfering in other people's business, but how could I just sit back and do nothing either? I felt that I'd been guided to speak to this man, as the path had been supernaturally cleared for me after my prayer. As I approached the cabin, I determined that no one was actually there, so that was when I decided to kill some time while I waited for the people to come back, by exploring the woods that flanked the cabin to see if I could get any sightings of the strange critter that I'd observed earlier on in the morning, staring at me from the window. I was inquisitive about what it was, and was pretty certain it hadn't been a bear. I was eager to get to the bottom of this intriguing, insidious mystery. I began hiking into the woods, and was glad that I was wearing appropriate shoes, as the snow was very deep. That was when I observed these very large footprints in the snow that looked human, only infinitely larger, as the size of these feet were massive and were possibly 18 inches long and 8 inches across. I noticed that the curious footprints trailed deep into the sylvan. I hasten to say curiosity got the better of me, and I was not embroiled in thoughts for my own safety either, which was exceedingly odd. In fact, on the contrary, I didn't give the matter a moment's consideration, as I was desirous to follow these footprints to see where they ultimately led. Nothing was to prepare me for what I would encounter. I stealthily followed the footprints until I observed the dark silhouette of a very large critter whose gargantuan dark brown form was pronounced against the vast undulating expanse of glistening crisp white snow. Luckily his back was turned away from me, and so I quickly took cover behind a rocky outcrop and surreptitiously slid my tiny pair of binoculars out of my handbag to focus in on the critter. I nearly dropped them in astonishment when I realised at once that this critter was no bear. But what on earth was it? This stocky, bulky, hair-covered critter possessed overlong arms and huge human-like hands, and was easily over 7 foot tall and 600 pounds. In a trice it turned around to face my direction, although thankfully it did not discern me. That was when I realised the gravity of what I was seeing, as the humanness of this creature was nothing short of extraordinary. I could hear the involuntary loud thumping of my heart pounding violently in my chest, and even feel its intense vibration as my shaking hands kept watching the critter with a mixture of awe and total wonderment. Then it suddenly dawned upon me like a bright spotlight illuminating my thoughts. Could this be a Bigfoot, I wondered in awe? Of course it was. It couldn't be anything else. I'd always perceived that Bigfoot was a creature of fiction, but I do remember an uncle of mine telling me once that it was highly likely that creatures of fiction may have existed at one time in our reality, like unicorns or elves, and as a young child that idea had always appealed to me, whether it was true or not. As I was considering all this in my mind, my binoculars fell onto the ground with an almighty loud thud, and I was thinking, "Oh no, please, don't let the creature see me." But it was too late. In seconds, the Bigfoot was standing literally 5 feet away from me. For a moment, I was filled with the most gut-wrenching fear that can only imagine is similar to what you might feel standing in the presence of a dangerous predator, much like a lion, tiger, or elephant. For indeed, this creature was built like a rhino and demanded immediate respect. It was easily as intimidating as any of these aforementioned remarkable beasts, maybe even more so. I knew at once that this critter could kill me in a heartbeat without even breaking a sweat, as he was built for speed, power, and strength. Every part of his Herculean body was rippled with dense, sinewy muscle. I remember I wanted to run away so very badly, but I just couldn't. I don't even know why. I just stood there staring at the critter, feeling sick to my stomach, and I could taste the nausea rising up at the back of my throat. In that moment, I was certain I was going to die. I do not remember a time ever being this terrified by anything before in my life. In fact, my fear level was off the charts. At closer inspection of the prodigious critter, I knew he was the one that had been staring at me through the cabin window earlier on in the morning. I realised by the expression on his face that he also recognised me, and he seemed so delighted to see me, almost as if I was an old friend of his. The critter pointed towards the cabin and then to himself, and I knew he was saying, "I saw you this morning through the window." He began to make a few excited whoops. Whoop! Whoop! That actually made me laugh. In that moment my fear dissipated as fast as the steam from a cup of hot coffee. I pointed towards the cabin and then to him, and I said, "Yes, that was you this morning." The expressive, unusual critter whooped again. Whoop! Whoop! It was like he was saying, "I can't believe it's actually you. And you came all this way just to find me." And I suppose in a strange, curious way, I had done so. That is what I sensed he was actually saying to me, with his exuberant, garrulous chatter that sounded a lot like gibberish. It was incredulous to observe how human this extraordinaire creature was close up, because his deep-set golden brown eyes were intelligent, discerning, and kind. I didn't even detect an ounce of malice or aggression towards me on his part. I noticed his leathery grey face was incredibly human-like. His dark nose was flat against his face, and his pronounced brow ridge furrowed with deep wrinkles. I could swear the critter was actually smiling at me, as its long, thin lips twitched up at the edges. For a long while the critter chattered away jubilantly, and I nodded at him as if I understood everything he was saying, although of course I didn't. I did discern that every time he was happy about something that he was telling me in his chattering language, he would make a low whooping sound. I know people talk about Bigfoots making high-pitched whoops, but these ones were very conversational and expressive, more like an exclamation mark or something being very good or exceedingly pleasing as part of a strange language. All of a sudden we could hear the sound of human voices talking to each other coming towards the cabin. And that was when the critter suddenly became very self-conscious and self-aware. He became reticent and began gliding away, moving his body with such a seamless grace. He looked like he was floating on top of the snow, and one of his strides was easily equivalent to about 5 feet. I realised that by nature, although curious, he was also evasive, elusive, and reclusive. I was sad that he had gone, but I realised that the voices were coming from the people that I was intending to visit. I could hear the young man saying to his wife, "Look at the size of these gargantuan footprints," and I realised he must have noticed the Bigfoot trails in the snow. I noted he was still studying them when I approached him. He was bending down on his knees and had placed a pencil next to the footprint by way of a measuring scale. I observed he was taking some cell phone pictures of the prints and was relieved to see that his wife had in fact retreated indoors. He looked up at me in surprise when he saw me coming towards him through the quaking aspen trees and gave me a warm-hearted smile which broke the ice and increased my confidence. "Big, aren't they?" I said, referring to the footprints. "Very odd," he agreed. "Definitely not a bear. But what they are, I can't even imagine." "Sir," I said, "my name is Martina. I need to speak to you about something. I'm your cleaner at the cabin." "Oh, hello, Martina," he said. "Very nice to meet you. What can I do for you?" I proceeded to tell him that I thought his wife might be a secret cutter, and I knew it was absolutely none of my business, and I didn't mean to pry or intrude, but I had personally been a cutter for many years, and getting help was the very best thing that had happened for me, and I thought he should know so that he could help his wife through her problem. The young man became enraged at my impertinence and said to me, "You are right. It's none of your business. Stop poking your nose in my affairs. Your job is to clean, not to offer counselling services to my wife. Now leave us alone at once." I remember walking away wishing that the ground would swallow me, and with all my heart that I hadn't interfered. I also wished I'd listened to my mother's wise advice. I was now certain that in the morning the man would have filed a complaint against me, and rightly so. I would receive my marching orders, which I well deserved. I also perceived my mother would be mad at me for being such a meddling, presumptuous, interfering busybody. I felt so afflicted by remorse and self-reproach, as if I'd done something treacherously wrong, and even the awe of seeing a Bigfoot was clouded and subdued by my escalating guilty conscience. "You're an idiot," I told myself again and again. "You don't go putting your nose into other people's affairs. What on earth have you done? How could you be so silly?" Imagine my amazement when the following morning the guests had left and my mother and I were cleaning out the cabin, and under the pillow was a letter addressed to me, containing over $2,000, and it read the following: "Dear Martina, I'm writing to apologise you for the way I reacted when you graciously and so eloquently informed me about my wife's deep dark secret. I just didn't want to believe that what you were telling me was true, and that I hadn't discerned that this was indeed going on. I appreciate that it must have taken an enormous amount of courage on your part to tell me all of this, but I'm so pleased that you actually did. My wife lost her father in a skiing accident last year, and I had absolutely no idea that her inconsolable grief was so bad that she had actually sought relief in cutting herself, something that I gather she has been doing for 8 long months now. I knew nothing about this until you graciously brought it to my attention, of which I am eternally grateful to you. Please do not reproach yourself for telling me, despite the negative reception you received on my account. I confronted my wife last night about this issue, and she told me everything, and was so glad and relieved to share her issues with me. I will be ensuring that she receives the help she needs when she returns home. This is a small token of my appreciation for all your troubles on my part. Many thanks, Arthur Bordeaux." I read the letter to my mother, and she looked at me in astonishment. "You told him about his wife cutting herself? How could you do that?" she said, looking at me in horror. "I'm sorry, Mum. I know I shouldn't have told her, but I couldn't help myself. I had to interfere because I wanted to help her so badly." "In that case, maybe you did the right thing," said my mother. "Maybe you were meant to help her. Perhaps you were her earth angel." All this happened 6 long years ago, when a dark cutting secret ultimately led to an encounter with the hairy man himself, otherwise known as Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Carl, and I was born in the 40s in the Pacific Northwest, and was found in a little pedal bin in a girl's toilet cubicle by a cleaner at a girls' school. They never did find out who my mother was in those days. They established that it must have been a young teenage girl who had fallen pregnant and given birth to me in secret in the restrictive confines of a tiny toilet cubicle. I cannot imagine what a traumatic experience my birth must have been for such a young girl. I think she possibly did not realise she was pregnant at the time with me, or if she did, she concealed the pregnancy from her family and friends exceedingly well, and was not sagacious, prudent, or judicious enough to make any pragmatic and practical decisions in regards to me long term. I think she possibly hoped that if she didn't think about me, her predicament would magically be vanquished from her life and just disappear altogether. I gather the sanctimonious, rather pretentious and pompous school kept the matter of my birth very hush-hush and brushed it under the carpet, sheltering the school from any thorny scandals. For it would seem that knowledge of my birth might have caused many parents to become unduly alarmed that an underage girl in the school that their scrupulous children attended had given birth in a toilet. I gather there was a brief, very obscure report written in the local paper about my strange arrival in the world, but the name of the school was never mentioned for obvious reasons. I harbour no anger or resentment towards my mother. Neither do I even condemn her for the peculiar way in which I was found in the rubbish bin, although in truth I would have preferred her to have left me on a doorstep or on a church pew. I feel certain she was a frightened, naive, whimsical teenager who was just so overwhelmed by giving birth to me. She just didn't know how to handle what had happened to her. I think tossing me in that pedal bin meant that she could cast out her problem like you would a piece of toilet roll and not think about it any more, out of sight, out of mind, so to speak. I am sure she was terrified of the repercussions of being pregnant, the reproachful stigmas and long-term contemptuous ramifications of having a baby so young and out of wedlock. For believe me, in those days it was something highly slanderous and shamefully frowned upon. Many people were even disowned by their parents in such situations. I'll never know her true story. I wish I did. But I can discern that she was a very confused, frightened young girl, and for that I harbour no ill feelings towards her. How could I? Just compassion and empathy. Even years later, my mother never ever came forward to acknowledge that she was the one that had given birth to me in secret in a toilet cubicle at such a young, tender age. Nor did she make any inquiries about me. I think she kept her mouth shut because she was so frightened for the condemnation and judgment she would possibly receive. And she probably harboured this horrifying, humbling secret all her life, of which she took to the grave. As you can imagine, I was placed by the rigid, uncompromising authorities in the care of an apathetic, impassionate foster home for the first 6 years of my life. And then, much like a soccer ball, I was tossed around from one aloof and diffident foster home to another, living in areas like Washington State, Wyoming, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, all places in the Pacific Northwest. Some families that took me under their wings were kind and congenial, while others were indifferent and lukewarm towards me. In truth, I never felt fully loved, cherished, or accepted, so I learnt to survive all on my own from a very young, tender age to become independent, cloistered, and solitary, which possibly explains why I've been a very contented, unsociable loner all of my life, and have never married or had children of my own, nor have I ever regretted being a loner. My strange story that ultimately led to a curious Bigfoot encounter began when I was given a job in the early 80s, when I responded to an advertisement in the local paper to become a school caretaker for a local school in Washington State, which required living on the school premises and locking up the classrooms after hours, as well as doing mandatory checks throughout the night on the premises just to ensure that everything was in order, secure, and there were no attempted break-ins or fire hazards to contend with. I was hired on the spot by the amenable headmistress who warmed to me at once and liked the fact that I was a free-spirited person and a solitary maverick who thrived on singular company and was content living on my own in a bohemian, nonconformist lifestyle with my black and white cat I called Wildfire, a name that she valiantly earned from her bravery and courage. She had been rescued from a burning home by the fire brigade. I gather she had belonged to an elderly lady who had set a chip pan alight during the night and had completely forgotten about it, and she died in the fire due to the toxic fumes. Wildfire reminded me rather of myself, a born survivor, so I immediately adopted her, and I never regretted that decision. "It's a very lonely, isolated job," I had been warned by the headmistress, "not for the faint-hearted, but I need someone on the premises at all times for my own peace of mind." And so it was that I moved into a very rudimentary basic wooden cabin that was built in the 1800s and was situated on the rear of the school grounds, tucked away in a shaded clearing that was heavily flanked by an area of thick national forest and was once the home of the original headmistress that had been responsible for opening the first school in 1932. Before long I settled into my life on the school grounds with my cat Wildfire, and despite the hermetical simplicity of my life, I was very contented and satisfied as a human being. I suppose I was so used to solitude, and the modest demands of my most pressing needs were easily met, as I didn't need much to live very well. It was the simple things in life that I relished and appreciated the most. I enjoyed spending my time reading novels that I took out from the local library. I relished feeding the birds during the day and watching them gathering on my bird table to eat breadcrumbs. One of them, an initially reticent little robin, had become incredibly tame and was now perching confidently on my hand, eating crumbs from me, which was extraordinary, and I was absolutely thrilled. Every night I would walk around the school, rattling and jangling a large bunch of keys in my hands, checking the classrooms and locking up everything behind me, always shadowed by Wildfire that liked to follow me around like a devoted lap dog. One day as I was locking up one of the classrooms, my flashlight detected a little movement under one of the desks, and that was when I saw these frightened brown eyes staring back at me in alarm. I suddenly realised I was staring at a 9-year-old little boy. I was shocked. "Please, sir," said the boy, "don't tell anyone I'm here." I reassured the young boy that being in a freezing cold classroom on a bitter winter's evening was not the way for a growing young man to spend the long, lonely night. I took him back to my cottage immediately, where I prepared him a hot cup of chocolate and made him something to eat, while he sat back warming up against the crackling fire, looking heartily relieved. "Where are your parents?" I asked him, looking at him through my wizened eyes, as he gobbled up my hot pot very hungrily. "My mother's dead," he said. "I think she died when I was very little, of a brain aneurysm. My father takes care of me now." "Where is your father?" I asked. "Why did he not pick you up from school today?" "He's a drunk, sir. He often forgets to pick me up." "That's not good," I said. "Do you have any other family?" "I have a grandmother that lives in Wyoming. She's very nice, sir." "What's her name?" I asked. "Joy Jenkins," he said. Before long I managed to trace this young boy's grandmother, and I phoned her to tell her about her grandchild being left behind at school, and the woman was utterly appalled. "I knew I couldn't trust my wretched son to take care of my grandchild," she piped. "Ever since Tanny died, that was his wife, of course, he's never been the same. I told him he needed to pull his socks up and get a grip, as he has a child to raise, but he's like a pig wallowing in the mud. I mean, it's ridiculous. He seems so determined to drag everybody else down with him. Selfish sod," she said. "I mean, I know he's been through a lot of emotional trauma, but his wife's been dead for 7 long years now. He needs to take some kind of responsibility towards the boy. It's not all about him, you know. Oh, look, I really do appreciate that you're not getting the authorities involved. I will come to get my grandson immediately." I am glad to say that the grandmother was true to her word, and that little boy was just over the moon to be reunited with her. She ruffled his hair affectionately and told him that he would not be spending any more nights hiding under school desks, and the poor little boy looked heartily relieved. I was delighted for him. I'm also glad to say that the grandmother was legally able to adopt her grandson, which was the very best thing that could have happened to the little boy. I'm pleased I did not call the authorities, because I knew what it was like from bitter experience having social services caught up in the nitty-gritty of your lives and hovering over your life like a sparrowhawk, waiting to pounce on anything that did not conform to their unyielding regulations. That was the last thing I wanted for that poor boy. I made it my duty to visit him from time to time and take him out for a day of fishing or so. I could find out whether he was being treated right by his grandmother that way, and my troubles were laid to rest when he revealed that he was very happy and making lots of friends at his brand new school. So I was very pleased for him. One morning, several days after that incident, I awoke up early to unlock all the classrooms after a heavy night of torrential rain. I noticed these huge muddy footprints that led from the forest all around the outer perimeters of the school, and it concerned me greatly that there must be a trespasser on the premises looking to break into one of the classrooms. There was only one big problem, and that was that the person walking on the premises had a slightly deformed foot, which might explain why he did not wear shoes, as I noticed the big toes on both feet were splayed to the right, and the second oddity was that his feet were absolutely enormous. But I told myself that the rain might have enlarged the footprints, because water has the propensity to enlarge anything. I quickly covered up the footprints, as I didn't want the fastidious headmistress to become unduly alarmed. The heavy rainfall lasted for several long days, and every morning I would discover these strange muddy footprints around the school, and I would also discern smudges on windows that looked like someone had been pressing their noses against the glass panes. But that couldn't be possible, could it? Because the nose smudges were 8 feet off the ground. No one could be 8 foot tall, surely, I thought to myself. As you can imagine, I was befuddled by this increasing, rather perplexing conundrum. So it was on a Monday morning I climbed through the pole fencing and walked through the Sylvan, which is an area of forest I have never explored before. I knew it had been accessible to the public for many years, with hiking trails and so forth, and yet I hadn't ventured out there myself. I gathered by word of mouth and from what the headmistress had told me that the forests were considered haunted, and people had seen strange sightings and heard enigmatic anomalies in the woods, like yellow and blue light orbs, dark shadowy creatures, UFO activity, and peculiar screaming noises. Some people claimed to have walked into the area only to report experiences of missing time, of which they had no explanation for. I was a natural cynic, and so did not believe in this hocus-pocus stuff and nonsense, so I really didn't give the matter any further thought or consideration, and put it all down to rumours, idle speculation, and quirky superstitions. I do remember thinking how beautiful the verdant coniferous forest was that consisted largely of exceedingly tall, towering Douglas firs, spruces and western hemlock trees, and there was moss that swathed the tree trunks, draping branches and rocky outcrops in velvety green carpets. There was pretty lacy ferns that stretched out their resplendent, delicate emerald leaves across the forest floor. I also noticed some rugged-looking trails that I chose to follow through the elevated inclines that were surrounded by rocks, caverns and rocky ridges, and streams of water that cascaded and trickled over the rocks in a small, flowing, gentle stream. I could hear the pretty bird song in the valley, and could see some cute little cottontail rabbits hopping around the wood green, along with the odd squirrel darting up a tree observing me with big brown curious eyes. Suddenly my attention was drawn to this cave, submerged in the ground, surrounded by rocky outcrops that were strewn with moss. The hollow tunneled deep within the ground, and was seemingly exceedingly large. I decided I wanted to take a look into this cave that was sheltered from the elements, as I was sure that this would be the perfect quintessential spot for a vagrant to live. I would myself if I lived out in the woods. The opening was small and branched out to a very sizable cave, and on the ground I saw a very large nest that was covered in soft grasses, and lying within the nest were two curled-up creatures that looked like dark brown bear cubs. I now began to freak out, because there is nothing more treacherous than a mother bear and her cubs, and if you get close and personal to a mother bear's cubs, you're in grievous danger and trouble, let me tell you. I knew she was possibly somewhere close around, and I began to hastily make my way out of the cave. But then I heard her coming back, and I began to panic. Luckily in the cave there was one big stone in the far corner that I could hide behind and remain very still, provided I crouched down very low. My one concern was that the bear would smell me, because they have the most phenomenal sense of smell. But I was trapped, and I had no better option of escape other than to remain remarkably still. That was when I saw her as she entered the cave, but then I realised to my amazement that this was no bear. What was it? This was something completely different. In her hand she was carrying 3 dead rabbits, but I did not know what she was, for she looked like she was half human and half ape. There was enough light in the cave to see her clearly, but in a dim light, if you know what I mean. This critter was about 7.5 to 8 feet tall, and about 700 pounds or less, and she was very burly, solid and sinewy, with excessively large shoulders, long arms and powerful sturdy legs. She was covered in long flowing brown hair that was a lighter colour to her cubs. I noticed her head was triangular and literally folded into the shoulders with no evidence of a neck. The face was heart-shaped but very long, and the nose large but very flat, and the brow ridge wrinkled. She had a very wide but thin mouth and deep-set dark eyes. I was so dumbfounded that she was not a bear, but I was not relieved, because I thought by the look of her she could possibly kill a bear without breaking a sweat. I mean, this critter was so powerful and intimidating looking, she was built like an apex predator that is designed to take down very big prey. I did not want to be that prey. The critter made a chattering sound, and the 2 little ones rose up from their long sleep, stretching out their overlong arms like a human would do once they rise out of their beds. They were both about 3 foot tall and looked identical, so I'm pretty certain they might have been twins, but I can't be sure of that either. She handed them each a rabbit that they began to eat, much like we would a hot dog, but from the inside out, leaving out the outer pelt, like the skin of an avocado or a pawpaw. I could hear all 3 of the critters eating and gnawing, and all of a sudden the ape-like humanoid, or mother if you like, sniffed the air, and that was when I knew my cover was immediately blown, and I really thought I was living on borrowed time. I froze to the spot, and my stomach began to churn like butter. I felt nauseous and sick, like I wanted to throw up. I was terrified. She walked towards the stone where I was hiding, and the expression on her face was one of utter astonishment. I think she was so baffled to see me in her den that she was possibly unable to react immediately. She just stared and stared at me with an agog expression on her face, with her deep-set treacle-coloured eyes. She looked stupefied. All of a sudden, one of her little younglings exuberantly came darting towards me, chattering with excitement and enthusiasm, and offering me some of her dead rabbit, and her sweet actions seemed to break the ice. Suddenly, it would seem, instead of being the enemy, I had become a much-welcomed house guest, as the tense atmosphere suddenly lifted and subsided, and became very convivial. The youngsters kept offering me bites of their rabbit, and watching in absolute delight as I chewed the pieces of very unpalatable, raw, disgusting flesh, which I pretended to find absolutely delicious, which made the little ones exceedingly pleased. I spoke to them like I would talk to two young toddlers, and they seemed unconcerned about the fact that I looked remarkably different to them. It was really no different than playing with two human toddlers that want to play housey-housey with you. The energy was very relaxed. I can honestly say that these two younglings made the mother much more amenable towards me, and she began to physically relax as I played with them. In fact, I think she was quite happy that they had a distraction and were not demanding too much of her attention, like any younglings naturally always do. Before long, they were playing with my hair and marvelling at the soft texture of it, and making so many whoops that even the mother curiously came to examine it. She let out a delighted whoop herself when she touched my hair, and discovered how soft it was, and then she even smelt it. I distinctly remember her going, "Ooh!" How long those younglings played with my hair, I don't know. They didn't seem to grow tired of it, and I certainly did. Even the mother was teaching them how to braid, and they were so excited and fascinated by it. So by the time I did manage to leave the cave, I was covered in hundreds of very tight little plaits that looked exactly like dreadlocks, giving me the distinct look of a hobo. I managed to say my goodbyes to the critters, who clearly did not want me to go, and even the mother had enjoyed being relieved of her babysitting duties. But thankfully I succeeded in worming my way out of the cave. I was glad to get away. I was almost scared of becoming their prisoner. But at the same time, I knew I had experienced something pretty special. Later that afternoon, I had an appointment with the headmistress and completely forgot about my rag-tailed braided hair, and I'll never forget how the headmistress kept giving me a peculiar, disapproving look. I wondered why she was looking at me like that. Then she said, "Carl, I don't mean to speak out of term, but this is a very conservative school, and I know you're only a caretaker, but I am not keen on my staff wearing dreadlocks. It's just not very appropriate for a school, if you know what I mean. It's not a look that we take very well here." "Yes, ma'am," I said. "I'll fix it." I soon realised that the big feet in the muddy ground after the rain and the smudge marks on the windows must have belonged to the female critter that I'd encountered. I never concerned myself with her presence around our school, as I knew she meant no harm really, but was just curious about the school and its kids. As for the little critters, I never visited them again, but there were times I would hear them whooping across the valley, and it always brought a smile to my face. I am now an old man, living in a retirement home. I'd like to be living on my own, but I can't, as I need help. But I do have friends, more friends than I've ever had in my life, but looking back on my life as a caretaker at the school, I do so with many fond memories. And it was 20 years ago that I discovered that the critters I encountered all those years ago were Bigfoot, and I was encouraged by one of the staff to write to you. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Linda, and I'm from Seattle in Washington State, and have lived here all my life in a lovely neighbourhood called Denny, which is located in east central Seattle, bounded by Lake Washington and on the south of Howell Street. Lake Washington is exceedingly picturesque, utopian and gloriously beautiful, and is the largest silvery lake in King County and the second largest natural lake in Washington. My family resided in a very attractive, aesthetically pleasing federal-style home on half an acre of land that overlooked the exquisite views of Lake Washington, the captivating Bellevue skyline, and the panoramic scenery of the Cascades, and we were literally minutes away from downtown Seattle, so it didn't get better than that. I grew up in this delightful scenic environment, the only daughter of exceedingly assiduous, punctilious and hard-working parents who were actively involved in their medical careers and quite literally would eat, drink and sleep medicine. I promise you, even over the dinner table, that is pretty much all they would ever talk about. I sometimes had to remind them with a little nudge here and there that I would appreciate it very much if the conversation could veer away from life-saving heart surgeries to something more practical like discussing the weather or what we would eat for our barbecue next Sunday. I assure you nothing was worse than eating a beef hot pot and having to listen to the gory graphic details of a stomach pumping procedure given to someone who'd taken a cocktail of sleeping pills. It was amazing that I didn't have digestive upsets all the time. My father was a trauma surgeon and my mother a nurse, and they worked together as part of a large trauma team in A&E on standby at the hospital. They both ascertained that their jobs were indeed a life calling. Let me assure you that this taxing job is most certainly not for the faint-hearted. It would seem my father loved bringing people back from the brink of death, and my mother adored fussing over people. As you can imagine, the most horrifying and visually disturbing accident and emergency cases, some of those harrowing and gruelling scenes, would possibly make even the most hardened among us more than a little queasy. They were never sure of what kind of patients that my father would receive on a daily basis, and they ranged from victims of shootings, stabbings, car accidents, and any emergency events that you can think about. You name it, my parents had pretty much seen it all. Growing up, my mother's younger sister June moved in with us shortly after I was born to help raise me and take care of me, as both of my parents worked the precarious shift of a doctor on call. When I was about 13 years old, sadly June left our home to live in Wenatchee in Washington after she fell in love and got married to her husband Ken. Wenatchee is the mountain gateway between western Washington and the agricultural areas of the Columbian Plateau to the east. This is significant to my story that ultimately led to my incredulous Bigfoot encounter in 1997, when I was 21 years old at the time. As you can imagine, June was like a second mother to me, as she had played such an intrinsic part in taking care of me as a young girl growing up, and so we were invariably exceptionally close, and the greatest of friends, which meant that we could talk on the telephone several times a week, if possible. One day she asked me if I would consider house-sitting her 3 cats while she and her husband went away on a 3-week Caribbean cruise. I didn't hesitate to accept the offer. It would be a great change of scenery for me, and there were so many adventurous trails in the area, and I loved exploring, so I knew it would be great fun. The neighbours will look after my 2 mischievous Bassets, she assured me, and they're very fond of their 2 black Labradors, and they love hanging around together, so you don't need to worry about them. I just feel that even though the cats are staunchly independent, I do like to feel that there's a human presence in the house while I'm away. I just hope you won't be too bored being in that house all on your own. I'll be fine, I assured her. You might be surprised to learn that I'd never been to Wenatchee before. In those days, with my parents' laborious, inflexible work schedule, it was always June and Ken visiting us in Seattle, rather than the other way round. I knew that it was considered one of the best places in Washington to live, as the year-round seasonal weather is considered great, and the neighbourhoods are very vibrant, with a rich art and cultural scene, and beautiful parks and playgrounds, not to mention over 20 state parks to explore. I studied the map for my journey ahead, and realised it was not as far as I had anticipated, and fortunately it was only about 2.5 hours at a stretch of travelling time in the car, which was reassuring, because I'm not a very patient driver at the very best of times. Before long, I found myself driving down several uneven, precipitous country roads, well off the beaten track. I drove past fields of sagebrush, open prairies, mountainous valleys, alpine forests, silvery lakes, and apple orchards. Then I saw a large sign that read, "Red Apple Hollow, this way," with an arrow pointing ahead, which was June's property. In a trice, I was driving through an open, rather rusty-looking cattle gate, down a long gravel, rather coarse driveway that prompted my car to jolt and wobble as the pebbles thrashed against the undercarriage. Soon I was parking outside the most beautiful Arcadian-looking farmhouse that was not old, nor was it new, but it was really rather rustic and quaint, reminding me of some of the charming farmhouses I'd seen on a trip to Tuscany once. It had that old-world vintage charm about it, and that quintessential ageless ambience, and it was oozing with retro character. This classic house was white with large French windows and a grey slate roof. It was nestled against a backdrop of mountainous valleys that bordered the edges of an alpine forest that stretched back for many miles, and was part of an area of national forest that was, I gather, frequented by many hikers. Well, so I assumed at the time. I noted that on the left-hand side of June's property was a very large apple orchard containing a ubiquitous amount of apple trees, and then there was a very expansive front yard of undulating green turf, pretty borders of flowers, and a scattering of pretty trees. As I ventured into the house, I was greeted by 3 sizable rotund-looking cats that looked like they could do with a visit to Weight Watchers. Indeed, one was so big he would have made a chubby pug look small. There was 1 ginger Tom and 2 black and white queens, and they were very affectionate and began to purr profusely. I could see why June loved them so much. They were the most gregarious, convivial cats that I've ever met in my entire life, which surprised me greatly, as most cats were usually standoffish towards me. The eclectic house, with its quirky antique pieces of select furniture, was really rather cosy and comfortable, with dozens of bookshelves filled with ancient books, cosy settees, large open fireplaces, interesting artworks, and rich vibrant Persian rugs that were strewn over the wooden floors. It was all very agreeable to me. Before long I'd settled into a large cushy lounger by a cosy crackling fire, watching television and being pinned down by 3 hefty purring cats that made it almost impossible to move. And as the weather was getting considerably colder, I was feeling as snug as a bug in a rug, shall we say, and so I slept in that spot all night. The next morning I decided to take a brisk, invigorating walk into the national forest that bordered June's beautiful home, and I surreptitiously climbed under the fence as a shortcut. Before long I was rambling down what appeared to be an ancient hiking trail that I guess was still frequented by many hikers, and it was exquisite to behold. I've always adored wooded areas, but this one was off the charts in its sumptuous resplendence and idyllic beauty. The tall, statuesque alpine trees, like Douglas firs, mountain hemlocks and pines, rose up into the sky like masterful giants, allowing soft shafts of sunlight to dance through their branches, dappling the forest floor in shimmering, soft, pearly light. The evergreen oasis was carpeted in velvety moss that swathed the undulating rocky crags, boulders and tree trunks in this exquisite, lavish, velvety green blanket. It was such a wonderful day, and the magical birdsong in the forest was so uplifting and awe-inspiring. I spotted blue jays, robins, and even a single wood thrush on the branches of trees, tweeting away merrily. I was transfixed by a brief random sighting of deers, squirrels and chipmunks. Even though I was hiking down many of these rocky paths in a perfect pair of hiking boots, I did notice the perilous, precipitous path had become precariously steep, rugged and unstable. It all seemed to become rather skiddy, and I began to wobble unsteadily on my legs, and lost my balance occasionally, slipping from time to time. I should have called a halt to this increasingly arduous hiking trek, which had become exceedingly treacherous, but sadly I didn't. Nothing was to prepare me for what was to happen next. All of a sudden, as I reached out to put my foot upon a mossy-covered rock, I slipped and lost my balance and went flying backwards, landing on a rocky crag with an almighty thud. The pain was instantaneous and not delayed, as it shot through my body like a piercing arrow. I lay on the undulating rocky surface for a moment, unable to process what had just transpired. I was stunned and stupefied, too much so to move a muscle. I could feel my heart thundering violently through my chest wall, and I knew I was confounded by shock. I tried my very best to shift my body, but the throbbing pain was just too terrible for words. Yet, ironically, it did not look like I'd broken anything. But even when I tried to lift myself off the ground, it was just too agonizing. I just couldn't do it. I realized that my only hope was to wait for a hiker to cross my path and get me the help I invariably needed. I lay on the ground just waiting for help to arrive, but no help came my way. This was when I concluded that maybe this part of the national forest was not really used much by the hikers, and I could see why. It was precarious, to say the least. Once again I tried to manoeuvre my body, but the pain was so debilitating. I did try to fight the doleful, insufferable, stabbing sensations like a valiant warrior, because I needed to get up, but I just could not. Nor could I comprehend why I was so incapacitated. I'd certainly had a nasty fall and been badly bruised, as the unsettling, irksome pain all over my battered body confirmed this fact. Yet I couldn't determine that anything was broken at all. I did discern that I'd successfully sprained my ankle, twisted a wrist and hurt my back quite substantially, but as far as I knew, I hadn't broken anything. I decided to cry out for help, in the off chance and vain hope that a distant hiker would hear my frantic calls from far away. So that is what I did, but my yells were just met by the haunting sound of silence, alongside the pretty tweets and warbles of the bird's song. I began to become very despondent, discomposed and fearful, because I knew that at night time the forest would become alive with lethal predators like mountain lions, coyotes and bobcats. I perceived that being disabled meant that I was a sitting duck for these hungry, voracious predators. I could already behold the hazy shadows of impending darkness descending over the valley like an ominous black thundercloud, as the light of day switched her lights off. In the twinkling of an eye, the forest descended into darkness and was filled with the orchestral sounds of crickets and frogs. Once again I tried to raise my non-compliant, prevacious body off the ground, but the stabbing, thundering pain in my back ripped through my body like a powerful electric shock, and I knew I was doomed. If I survived one night out here in this hostile, nefarious wilderness, I would consider myself a very lucky girl indeed. I knew my imminent prospects were not promising and certainly did not look good. I called out for help in one last desperate attempt to be heard, but it was to no avail. Who would be walking around at this time of night anyway? "Is anyone out there? Help! Help! Is anyone out there? Help!" But once again the night continued as it had done so before, and my words seemed to be lost among the clouds of the night. There was a gentle, cool breeze blowing against my face, which was really rather refreshing, but moving stealthily into the shadows with the artful, guileful cunning and skill of a domestic cat was my very first sighting of a coyote. The critter's nose was sniffing around me curiously, several yards away, and he sensed my vulnerability and announced his finding by howling out into the night with a series of calls, sounding rather like a dog. In what seemed like seconds, there were over a dozen coyotes moving cautiously towards me, and I knew then that my life was as good as over. I was powerless to defend myself against these critters. All I could do was scream and shout out, "Get away! Go away! Leave me alone! Go away! Get away! Go!" For a while my screams did the trick and appeared to startle the coyotes because they scattered, but once again their steely resolve returned, and they gained an increased sense of confidence as they stealthily moved towards me with even more of a determined resolve. I knew this was going to be a very difficult death, as these critters would eat me alive. I would have been better off being mauled by a bear. Once again I started to scream out, "Go away! Leave me alone!" The next thing that I knew was that I was being scooped up into the arms of a middle-aged man with a long, wispy white beard. When I saw him, the relief was overwhelming and monumental. It felt like I'd been rescued by an angel, and I began to relax, and after that I must have just fallen asleep, as I remember nothing more at all. Imagine my surprise to find myself waking up into the bright new morning, to find myself lying on an old mattress inside a very large, spacious cave under a comfortable duvet. The entrance was covered in curtains of shrubbery, and there was a fire in the middle of the rock floor where a hole had been created in the room for a chimney or a powerful air vent. The slender, strong, athletic man who had rescued me was sitting on the tree stump with his back facing me, boiling a kettle over the fire pit, and the cave was enveloped in a cosy warmth. I looked around the Spartan cave in astonishment, as it was a perfect cosy home. There were carpets on the stone floor, and a stone area that had been arranged and made up into a large table. There were tree stumps used for chairs. It was all very simple, rustic and rather basic, but at the same time homely and comfortable. Suddenly the man was sensing that I was awake, so he looked over at me and said, "Are you all right, love?" "I'm not sure," I said. "My head is thumping and my back is killing me." "Don't you worry," he said. "I used to be a doctor, and I see you've not broken anything. but you have sustained a very nasty fall, and you are badly bruised and very knocked up. It would seem that you've sprained your wrist and your ankle, but you'll be fine. What you really need to do is to rest up for a few days. Your body has taken a nasty shock, and that's not good for anyone." He handed me a hot mug of tea and a couple of painkillers. "Here, drink this. It'll do you good and ease the pain." "Do you make a habit of hiking out in caves?" I asked him. "This is my home," said the man, stroking his beard in deep contemplation. "I've lived here for many years now," he said. "I wouldn't have it any other way. I enjoy being close to nature." "Wow," I said. "What made you decide to live like this?" "Well, it's a long story," said the man. "By the way, my name is Joe." "I'm Linda," I said. "You have the same name as my wife." "I like it," he said. "Lindas are good people. Never met one I didn't like." "You have a wife?" I said, looking at the man in surprise. "Where is she now?" "Oh, she lives in the town." He said this in a very nonchalant way. "Well, why you're not living together?" I asked. "Are you divorced?" "No, nothing like that," he said. "It's a long, drawn-out story. I'm a Vietnam vet," he told me. "When I returned from the war in Afghanistan, I was haunted by the dreadful scenes of carnage and war that hounded me day and night. They tormented me like a tortured soul until I could take it no more. I had about enough of everything, but I was just too much of a coward to load a shotgun and pull the trigger. So I decided I would camp out into the woods and just starve myself to death. I wasn't going to deprive myself of water, of course, but stopping food, it's a painless way to go." "I'm not sure that's true," I said. "I think extreme hunger can be very debilitating. I remember hearing about the catastrophic desperation of the starving people in concentration camps during World War II. I don't think it was a pleasant or easy death for any of them." "Well, there is a difference, dear," said Joe. "They wanted to live. I wanted to die." "Was the war in Vietnam really that bad?" I asked. I did hear there was a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder. "It was terrible. The most soul-destroying thing of all was seeing young boys caught up in that war. I was a doctor as well as a soldier. I tried to save many of my fallen comrades, but it was impossible most of the time. It was the terrified expressions on men's faces that still haunt me today. The dreadful waste of life, the carnage, the gruesome scenes of blood. Oh, they were so hard to stomach. If the war didn't kill you then, the post-traumatic stress would get you after the event. That's what happened to me, and to many others. It ruined my life and my marriage, although I still love my wife Linda with all of my heart. That hasn't changed." "Go on," I urged. "I'm fascinated." He continued, "I knew the only way to relinquish these horrifying mental graphic images in my head was to die, which is why I came out into the woods. I was armed, of course, to protect myself from wild animals. I didn't want to die that way. And while I was strong enough, I would build a fire every day. But I surrounded myself with a large circle of thorns to put off all the predators. I discerned hiding out here would mean that no one would ever find me until it was too late. And once I was gone, the wild animals could feast on my remains. People would never know what really happened to me." "What about hikers?" I asked. "They would spot you, surely." "You do not know this part of the National Forest," said Joe. "No one frequents this part. It's way too treacherous. Look at how you injured yourself walking up some of those precarious steep paths and mountainous slopes. No one with any sense walks over here. Excuse the pun if you don't mind me saying so. If I hadn't found you in time, those coyotes would have dined on your remains. I can assure you of that. Those critters are relentless in their determination, which is why they are such efficient killers." "How did you find me?" I asked him. "Uma took me to you. He was the one that saw you." "Who's Uma?" I asked. "It's Uma," he said. "Well, he's the wild man of the woods. He rescued me. after I became very weak from refusing to eat. He's the very reason I'm alive today. I have him to thank for that. He brought me to this cave and fed me until I was fully recovered. I remember he refused to leave me until I'd eaten something. When I got better, I decided I liked the cave that Uma found me, and I relished living in the Sylvan away from society, which is what I decided to do. Uma and I soon became very firm friends, although he does speak not many English words, I might say. I taught him a few words like hi, bye, good, come, and Joe, but that's about all he can say. I like him, and he still looks after me today, bringing me lots of cuts of meat from his hunts. He treats me like a member of his own family. We have a very good binding friendship. Where does Uma live? I asked. It's Uma. Where does Uma live? I asked. He lives in a deep underground cave with 5 of his family members, but I only get to see Uma, as the rest of his family are quite reticent and shy. Even after all these years in the woods, they are still wary of me. Never been comfortable around people. Don't trust them as far as they can throw them. Does your wife know you live here? Oh, yes, she does. Linda's a very good lady. She understands me. I visit her once a month in the town, and I have a bath at her place. She gets my clothes and laundry done, and I return here with basic necessities of life like tea bags, milk powder, coffee, oats, sugar, cocoa, and any basic ingredients that I might need. Once a month I bring Uma a couple of jars of peanut butter and a bag of salted chips, as he does so much for me. Joe decided that I would be staying with him for several days, as he didn't feel it was wise for me to move a muscle. I was happy about his choice, because I was comfortable being taken care of, and I hated the idea of even moving an inch of my body at this stage, as it was incredibly tender. I was amazed at the incredible lengths that this kind Vietnam vet went for me in order to ensure my extreme comfort. He did very kindly go back to June's house for me and fed all her cats, that he described as morbidly obese. Joe was very kind, because he visited his wife just to bring me some anti-inflammatories and pain pills, and another duvet and extra pillows, so he did go overboard for me. Every evening Uma would bring Joe something from a hunt, like a rabbit or a squirrel or a fish or even a leg of a deer or something, and Joe would cook it over the fire pit, and we would have a delicious dinner together, as he was indeed a great cook. The first time Uma visited the cave and saw me lying there on the mattress, he looked reticent, awkward, and slightly uncomfortable. I could tell my presence made him feel ever so slightly discomposed and rather uncertain. "Don't mind him," said Joe to me. "Uma is just a little shy, that's all." "Uma," he said, pointing to me. "This is Linda." Uma nodded at me and said, "Hi," which was one of the few words he knew. He tried to say Linda, but he couldn't pronounce the word, as his voice elevated to a high pitch that made me smile rather. It touched me to the quick that he tried to say my name. I remember when I first saw Uma, I almost thought a bear had suddenly walked into our cave, and I nearly had a heart attack. But Uma was no bear. This was the wild man that had befriended Joe, and he was unlike any critter that I'd ever seen before in my entire life. I had no comprehension of what he was. I discerned that Uma's physical humanoid shape, the features of his dark brown leathery face, including facial expressions and his overall emotional intelligence, made him appear remarkably human. Yet without a doubt there were ape-like influences to his genetic makeup, like the distinctive dark flowing hazelnut hair that covered his entire body, the overlong powerful arms, and the muscular upper torso, and the pyramid-shaped head that flowed down seamlessly into his shoulders in one sweep. There were areas on his body that had less hair, like the knee and under the arms and the face. Uma was intimidating in size and stature, for I indeed believe he could certainly threaten, subdue and scare off a grizzly bear without much difficulty at all. He looked like a serious apex predator, and in this woodland area he was without doubt the king of the forest. I have never been good at size or weight, but if I was to estimate or guess his weight, I'd say he was about 7 foot tall to 600 to 700 pounds, and he was very stocky and sinewy, with muscular defined thighs that were lean. Yet he was agile and extremely graceful. I noted his face was broad but long, and his brow ridge very prominent and heavily furrowed by lots of wrinkles, and his deep-set eyes were a golden brown colour, but they were full of life and vitality and genuine warmth, which was very, very nice. When I saw Umar, I remember thinking how incongruous his dominating, formidable and imposing appearance was, in contrast to his docile, gentle and congenial nature. It rather reminded me of one of those dangerous dogs that acts like a puppy and is completely oblivious of his own power and strength. Umar acted as if he was like another human, and he would nod and communicate with Joe using bobbing head gestures, very expressive facial expressions, and sweeping movements with his arms and hands. He was a fabulous communicator, despite the language barrier, and I could tell that he and Joe were the very best of friends and looked out for each other. I liked Umar because he was such a likeable, jovial character, and his beautiful golden brown eyes were soulful and bright. I noticed he rarely liked it when Joe laughed. He would try and emulate Joe laughing, and the sound he made was so high-pitched it sounded more like a hyena, and was so comical. I could see that Umar loved nothing more than to make us all smile. He was most certainly a born comedian. Every day without fail, Umar came to the cave to bring Joe something from the hunt. He would sit down on a tree trunk for a while by the crackling fire and watch Joe busying himself around the cave. I do remember on one occasion he brought me a pile of red apples and some berries that he presented to me in a large potato sack. I was touched by his kindness. He really seemed to care. He pointed to me and I knew he was saying, "Are you any better?" and I nodded. Joe had taught him to clap his hands if he was pleased about something, and when I nodded, he began to clap his hands excitedly and made a loud whooping sound. Whoop! When I was able to walk and the pain had subsided, Joe got Umar to carry me all the way back to my aunt's house, and when he carried me over that rocky terrain, in his arms he walked over it with such a smoothness. I have ridden camels and elephants and horses in the wild, but never have I been carried over such a long distance on such rugged mountainous terrain with such smoothness and ease. Umar was incredible. I am very glad to inform you that I made a full recovery, but I never ever told June what had happened to me when I stayed at her home all those years ago. Nor did I tell her about the Vietnam vet that I met. Neither did I tell her about the strange critter called Umar, whom I now know was a Bigfoot. All these years later, I know that Umar and Joe saved my life, and I am forever indebted to them for that. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Pearl, and I'm from the rich cultural evergreen state of Washington, which is the 18th largest state in America and consists of numerous islands, fjords, bays, glaciers, temperate rainforests, mountain ranges, prairies, agriculture land, and so much more. We also produce more apples here than any other state in North America. I've lived here all my life, but the story that led to my incredulous encounter with the hairy man happened when my husband and I moved to the small picturesque town of Forks in 1994. The quaint little town is situated on the Olympic Peninsula, and we have amazing silvery rivers here, known for their abundance of steelhead and salmon, and to the east of our town is the Olympic National Park. We chose to settle in this idyllic part of the world because it's absolutely exquisite here, with a thriving, spirited community and a close-knit, warm, welcoming populace. We moved into a really spectacular green leafy neighbourhood here, where all the individualistic houses had been built relatively close together, with pristinely manicured front and back yards. In truth, I think even the most mediocre of homes would find it incredibly difficult to look ugly here, surrounded by such sumptuous evergreen foliage, not to mention the statuesque Douglas firs, ponderosa pines and spruce trees that are scattered liberally throughout our neighbourhood. We moved into a whimsical, rather romantic craftsman-style home with a typical low-grey roof, wide eaves and triangular exposed beams, accentuated by thick round columns and a very sizable but attractive old-world stone porch. Our neighbourhood is heavily flanked by a vast area of dreamy natural forest made up primarily of spruce and Douglas firs trees, set up against the most panoramic views of undulating green valleys and the imposing hazy silhouettes of the mountains in the distance. One of the reasons we bought the house was because it possessed the most exquisite showpiece in the backyard, or pièce de résistance if you like, an archetype of note, shall I say, in the form of a quintessential koi pond that had been designed ingeniously by the previous owner. It would seem that no expense had been spared on the creation of this extraordinary conquest that had been executed with the finest attention to detail. It was overflowing with dozens of sizable, very beguiling large koi carp in the richest and brightest oranges that you've ever seen. Surprisingly enough, the koi were so friendly that when you put your fingers into the water, they would nibble you. I loved sliding my hands down their long, elongated bodies. This silvery gem was surrounded by sculptural rocky outcrops, and there were dreamy waterfalls that jetted white water down the rocky crevices into the rock pools below, and its crashing sound was so calming and relaxing. The rock pools were scattered with the most delicate ethereal pink and yellow flowing water lilies. On one side it was heavily fringed by clumping bamboo, and another with Bank of Canadas, which are an aquatic plant that help keep the pond clear by absorbing all the harmful nitrates in the water. This silvery expanse of shimmering water also possessed a very distinguishing feature, a purple bridge that brought out all the greens in the garden so magnificently. Then there were a couple of picturesque willow trees with very Junesque-shaped trunks swathed in carpets of luxuriant green moss and draping feathery leaves that hung over the water's edge. It was like a magical, enchanting sanctuary, and I even placed a whimsical statue of a large fairy in this perfect oasis, which might sound rather twee, but the whole area possessed that quintessential fairy tale fantastical feeling about it. I loved nothing more than chopping the vegetables for dinner and glancing out of my window towards the pond and watching the water cascading down the rocks. It was so beautiful to behold, and I would often just gasp because it would take my breath away. After living in Fork for over a year, I began to develop some close friendships with the locals in my neighbourhood, and we would often interact on social occasions with barbecues and drinks at sunset. One day I discovered that my next-door neighbour, a lady that I'm going to call Diane for the purposes of the story, had a secret up her sleeve that she wanted to reveal to me. I was promptly invited over to her house for tea to find out the source of this mystery. I remember she surreptitiously led me into the backyard, and I was in shock, for there before me stood a sizable pond that shone like a jewel in a crown. I was to learn that it had been customised for her specifically by a highly esteemed designer whom had won multiple awards for his outstanding showmanship in creating and engineering the most awe-inspiring ponds around North America. It was a triumph of note, and it was the epitome of the most enchanting magical pond that I'd ever discerned in all my life. I hasten to add that it far eclipsed mine in terms of its size and splendour. It was a tour de force to be reckoned. I was also bedazzled that something that was not even established at this stage could look this splendiferous, in its beginning stages, of course. I could only imagine what this tranquil oasis would look like in the years to come, once the plants around the pond became firmly established. I'd like to say that I was happy for my neighbour, but I'm sadly not that nice. I was more than a little green at the gills. I was also angry that she'd copied our pond, and I could sense that she was gloating that her pond was bigger and grander than mine. I began to feel like a petulant child, and when I returned home my husband asked me why I had such a long, discomposed face. "Diane's only gone and replicated our pond," I complained, "and hers is bigger and more stunning than ours." I could see she was conceited about it. You could see the smug look all over her face. I promise you she looked obsequious and pompous, just like a stuffed penguin, all puffed up and inflated by her own sense of self-importance. "Darling, there's no need to get so upset. We have a stunning koi pond, and if hers is bigger than ours, does it really matter?" "Yes, it does," I snapped. "It really does. It makes me sick to my stomach, and even the plants she's chosen are identical to ours." "Well, she must have been very impressed with our pond to copy us. They do say that copying someone is the biggest form of flattery." Well, of course she was boasting that she'd hired one of the top men in the business to design her pond, a man who's got so many awards. Can you believe that she had the gall to say, "I won't tell you how much it all cost"? But I discerned by the way that her mouth was twitching upwards that she was bursting to tell me. "What did you say?" asked my husband. I didn't say anything. I knew she wanted me to ask her the price, and so I just told her that her pond was very nice. My husband planted a kiss on my forehead. "You do look so cute when you're jealous," he chuckled. Fast forward a few weeks, and I was spending copious amounts of time relaxing by my pond. I just loved being out there. I loved watching my koi carp, and I loved just listening to the waterfall. But I soon discerned that my koi carp population had diminished and gone down significantly, and I was exceedingly puzzled about this peculiar sequence of events, so I sought some professional advice. I was told that maybe my fish were being attacked by birds of prey, and so I should put some pond netting on the surface, which I did, with what I must say was a great deal of regret, as it does spoil the look of the pond significantly. It was, however, necessary to protect my koi from predators. Yet despite my best efforts, I still began to observe my koi population going down quite dramatically. It was like one fish went missing a day. Once again I contacted the professional, whom suggested that possibly someone was stealing my fish. "It does happen," he told me. "Koi are in great demand these days, and the big ones don't come cheap." That was a light bulb moment for me, and with horrifying crystal-clear revelation, I knew at once who the mystery culprit was. Was it not enough that she had stolen my thunder by building an even more resplendent pond than my own? But now, to add insult to injury, she was actually stealing some of my koi. I was absolutely appalled and completely disgusted. I mean, how low could she sink? And so it was I surreptitiously played Diane a casual visit under the guise that I was popping over to say hello. "Oh, this is a lovely surprise," said Diane, opening her door to me. "I was going to come and see you. It's been a long while. I wondered where you've got to these days." "Well, I've been very busy," I snapped. "Would you like a coffee?" she asked. "That would be very nice," I said. "Do you mind if I look at how your pond is coming along?" "Be my guest," she said. I ventured out towards her beautiful glistening pond, and it was filled with copious amounts of bright orange carp, and I knew at once Diane had stolen well over 15 of my koi fish. I was certain of it. I recognised them, and I was as mad as hell. You could say that I was foaming at the mouth like a rabid dog. Not only had she tried to compete with trumping me with a grander, more majestic pond than mine, but now she had the audacity of pilfering some of my koi. I wasn't amused in the least, and I could feel the bile rising up at the back of my throat in total and utter disgust. How dare she, I thought. "You have a lot more fish than you used to have," I said, trying to sound as nonchalant as I could. "Oh, yes, isn't it wonderful? I was able to purchase them at a good price," she chuckled. "I bet," I thought. "Liar. Big fat liar," I thought inside my head. When I returned home from Diane, my husband asked me why my face was so long and downcast. "You look like a dog that had his eye on the fillet steak and ended up with a dry crust of bread instead," he said. "I think this Diane woman rubs you up the wrong way. Every time you visit her, your face transforms itself into a stormy thundercloud. What on earth has she done now? What's wrong?" "Diane has only been stealing our koi carp," I told him, my face growing crimson with rage. "Who does she think she is? She's stolen 15 of our big boys." "Are you sure about this?" asked my husband. "Of course I'm sure," I told him. "I'd recognise my fish anywhere." "Well, sweetheart, if that is true, you leave it all well alone. This is a very small town. We don't want to stir up trouble here and create a stink. We have to live next door to these people. The last thing we need is to have squabbles and bad relations with our neighbours. You are just going to have to bite the bullet and pretend it never happened. That's what you do in these situations." "But I want my fish back," I protested. "Don't do anything stupid, my dear," my husband warned me. "Believe me, it's not worth the bother. We can buy more fish, but we're unlikely to get new neighbours, and we don't want to fall out with them, do we?" I do remember that night not having a good night's sleep. I was tossing and turning in my bed, and I was sweating profusely. I knew with certainty that I had to get my fish back. Diane wasn't going to get away with this, I thought to myself angrily. No way. I didn't care what my husband thought, nor did I heed his warnings, because they had fallen on deaf ears. I had other ideas in mind, and a plan was already forming in my head. I lay back in my bed, visualizing Diana's gleeful face as she stealthily sneaked into my garden with a very large net in her hand, an oversized fish bucket. In my dream, I could clearly see the broad grin on her face getting wider and wider and wider as she began to steal my koi one by one and place them in her pond. Several times during the night, I felt I had to get up. I wanted to be sick and throw up. That was how ill I felt about it all. The following day I had my binoculars pinned on my neighbour's house, and when Diane and her husband left for a shopping trip, I quickly sneaked out of my house with a large net and an oversized bucket in my hand, only to bump into one of my nosy neighbours up the road, walking his 2 French bulldogs up the street. How annoying was that? "What are you doing with that big bucket?" he said, looking at me with a curious interest. "Nothing," I lied. "I thought I'd wash down some windows." The gentleman looked at my net, and then at my bucket, with a cynical look upon his face, and then, shaking his head, he meandered on his way, glancing back at me a couple of times, but I was not going to allow some pompous upstart to impede my mission in any way. I knew going to my neighbour's pond in the middle of the day was a risky business, but so powerful and overwhelming was this urge to get my fish back that I was totally beyond caring. Before long, I began sneaking into her backyard. I must admit I did feel like a burglar, and I began my mission. Let me assure you that this was not an easy job. It was very difficult to discern which fish were actually mine, so I just settled for any vibrant, attractive, good-looking fish that were similar. The bucket weighed a ton, and the water kept splashing out of my bucket. Before long, I managed to retrieve 10 of my fish, but decided to call it a day as I was utterly exhausted. The very next day, I once again continued with my retrieval project until my fish had all been happily returned to my pond, and the relief I felt was monumental. I have to confess I felt a sense of rising euphoria and triumph that I had finally outsmarted Diane. That would show her up for stealing my fish in the first place, I thought. The following day I received a visit from Diane and invited her in for a cup of coffee. I won't deny that my heart was thumping in my chest a little faster than usual because I sensed that she was on to me. But then why should I even care? I'd only retrieved what was rightfully mine. Why should I feel remotely guilty? "I was just wondering," she asked me, "if by any chance you've had any of your koi carp gone missing from your pond over the last couple of days. It would seem that 15 of my fish have just vanished into thin air." I tried to keep my expression very straight and stiff. "No," I said, "I have all my fish. You know what you should do? You should invest in a pond net. Perhaps you have a bird of prey attacking your fish." "I think it might be a very big bird of prey," said Diane sarcastically, giving me a calculated, willful look. One day as I was chopping vegetables in my kitchen, I suddenly saw something standing in my pond. I was stunned, and my first thought was that I was looking at a bear. I reached for my binoculars to have a better look at the critter. I nearly dropped them in astonishment, as I wasn't staring at a bear, but something very hefty that looked rather like a humanoid ape. It was covered in long, flowing, dark brown hair, and it had overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head that flowed into the shoulders in a seamless sweep. I observed the critter had a deep tanned-coloured face with a prominent brow ridge and deep-set dark eyes and a very flat nose, and also a wide but very thin mouth. What was it, I wondered in horror, for never in all my born days had I observed such a strange and curious beast. All of a sudden the critter plunged his big hands into the water and pulled out one of my big koi carp that was wiggling frantically. He thumped the fish hard against the side of my pond and began to eat it like you and I would eat a banana, although he ate the skin as well. I watched in absolute horror as this dreadful scene unfolded before my very eyes, and then once satisfied the critter leapt out of the pond with the agility of a frog. He glided away into the wooded area that flanked our properties on his powerful long legs, in 5-foot strides, with a grace and fluidity that was literally mesmerising. For a moment I stood still, frozen to the spot, transfixed like a statue. Was it possible I could have imagined that, I thought? No! I knew what I was seeing was dauntingly real. I began to tremble and wobble like a jelly, as the after-effects of my disturbing visual experience unsettled me greatly. For indeed this creature was easily over 7 foot tall and 600 pounds, and was built with power, girth and strength of any imposing predator, much like a rhino or an elephant. I began to make myself a cup of coffee, while I piled copious amounts of sugar in it, without even realising it, to calm myself down, for my nerves were frazzled. It suddenly occurred to me with horrifying revelation that the perpetrator of my missing koi carp was no other than this hairy humanoid, who had obviously been eating them all. I had been stealing Diane's koi carp in broad daylight, like a blatant in-your-face criminal, and they'd never been mine to take. Diane was innocent, and now I was the thief, and sneakily suspected that she knew that as well. Had she not said to me that the bird of prey must be very big? Was she referring to me? Now I really felt sick to my stomach, and incredibly embarrassed. How could I have got it all so wrong? The next day I decided to take a walk into the sylvan that bordered and fringed the outer perimeters of the properties in our street, from whence the critter had retreated the previous day. I noted a trail of very oversized footprints in the moist ground that I knew belonged to the critter, which I discreetly began to follow, not really even considering that I could potentially be walking into a viper's nest or the devil's lair. For indeed the creature I had observed from my kitchen window was not to be trifled with. Yet I was overcome with a heightened sense of curiosity. The sylvan is almost celestial in its transcendental magnificence, for it is like a world within a world, a sanctuary and oasis of resplendent rich greens. Its dreamy forest canopy embodies a dainty parasol that allows the prettiest shafts of sunlight to flicker through the branches, bathing the floor in dappled prisms of light, creating a sparkling ethereal magic that is indescribable. I love the way the sculptural, curvaceous branches of the trees are swathed in the sumptuous, velvety, rich moss, and even the rocky outcrops are not left untouched by its wand of lavish emerald opulence. And then the lacy ferns with their outstretched leaves envelop the forest floor, garnishing it with a vibrant array of verdant, feathery ornaments. As I began to walk, the pretty bird song was not lost to my ears, and the brief sightings of songbirds and squirrels brought a smile to my face. Yet my mind was on one mission alone, and it was to uncover the mystery behind the critter that was pilfering my koi. All of a sudden things began to change in the forest, and everything became inauspicious and deathly quiet. So quiet, in fact, that it became menacingly mendacious, disturbingly so. I'd always been informed by my father that when sounds of the forest turn off like a light switch, you can be certain of one thing, and that is that a predator is in your midst. I stood very still for a moment, hardly daring to draw breath, as I discerned that the critter I had observed could indeed be close by. This was almost certainly confirmed by the cocktail of pungent odours that perforated my nostrils with a stench that is unlike anything I have ever smelt in my life. It rather reminded me of a skunk. That was when I heard a man's yelling voice. I crept cautiously ever closer and hid behind a large spruce tree. I was not prepared for what I was about to see. I recognised the man, for he was the homeless vagrant that I sometimes saw begging in the town outside the local bakery. He wore layers of dishevelled clothes that hung off his body in limp rags. I could tell the intoxicated man was pixelated, as his tipsy body swayed precariously like a tree being blown in a heavy wind, and in one wobbly hand he held a bottle of vodka, most of which was drained, the last remnants which he kept pouring down his gullet in large, frantic swigs. Why had he screamed, I wondered? Was it because he was off his head in a drunken stupor, or had something frightened him? The sloshed vagrant cried out again, and I realised it was because he was staring at a huge, hairy humanoid, much like the one I had seen languishing in my pond the day prior. Yet this critter was different. He was infinitely more foreboding and menacing, and was unlike anything that I've ever beheld in my entire life. He looked like the devil himself. I began to tremble and shake as my body lost its ability to control its impulses. I also wanted to scream out in terror, but my vocal cords seemed to be locked. I could taste the bitter nausea rising up in the back of my throat. I longed to turn around and just run away, but I was incapacitated by the sheer horror of what I was witnessing. It was as if my life flashed before me in a series of photographs as I watched this hideous, duplicitous scene unfold before my very eyes. It seemed like a lifetime, but in reality it was possibly only a few seconds or minutes at the very most. Yet in the fabric of our time, it seemed to last forever. This hostile, capricious critter, whatever in God's name it was, had an evil, demonical, portentous glint in his dark, malevolent eyes that twinkled with a hideously reddish hue. He stood yards away from the man, leering at him savagely, and his mouth curled back to reveal a large set of oversized human-like teeth. He began to growl, easily eclipsing the roar of a lion, for the ground reverberated under the sound. The inebriated, bladdered vagrant stared at the critter with glazed eyes and seemed transfixed. I think he may have believed the alcohol he'd been drinking was having hallucinatory effects on him, for he looked stunned, almost as if he was certain he must be dreaming. I couldn't blame him for that, for the critter seemed so surreal, almost as if he had walked out of the pages of your darkest, most terrifying nightmares into our reality. Yet I knew without a doubt that this critter was as real as you and I are. "Go away! Go away!" slurred the drunken man, waving his arms around as if he was wishing away his illusory nightmare. "Go away!" I watched him staggering around and slurring on his inaudible words. "Now, you go away," he said, waving his bottle precariously. "You go away. Now you go away. Go away. Go away." Once again the critter growled, and then he lunged forward and seized the vagrant into his oversized hands like a rag doll and whirled the man in the air, tossing him up and down like a pancake. The man was still screaming, "Go away! Go away!" The critter seemed to enjoy the sport of scaring his victim half to death, and then finally he threw the man on the ground with an almighty thump, and the man let out the most painful grunts, for he was still alive and slurring. "Oh! Oh! Ooh!" This monstrous beast grabbed his neck and twisted it to the other side of his head, and I could hear that final click, and I knew it was all over, for the vagrant at least. I stood behind the spruce tree, hardly daring to draw breath, for indeed I was afraid that the very sound of my breathing, or even the drumming of my heart, would alert the critter to my presence. But I'm pleased to say he was oblivious to me. I knew that I needed to stay as still as I possibly could, because running off was not an option for me. Even my legs felt as heavy as bricks of cement, and my heart was in my mouth. I also knew if the critter saw me or heard me, I was dead. The critter was breathing heavily and sounded like a horse. He began to kick the dead body like a football, as if even in death the man offended and appalled and repulsed him. He had no respect for the human form, for in some way it offended him greatly. I watched in horror as he ripped off one of the man's arms like you and I would tear a chicken drumstick off a cooked chicken. He then glided over to the tree trunk and sat upright with his torso propped up against the tree, and his powerful legs spread out in front of him. He began to eat the arm, and he gobbled it up until all the bones were stripped clean. He then went over to the corpse and gouged out the eyeballs from the sockets, as if they were delectable cocktail olives, and popped them into his mouth, and ate them, with great gusto. He did the same for the tongue. Finally the critter threw the body over a tree trunk, much like a sack of potatoes, where it dangled precariously from the branches, like a white mannequin with open sockets. He then left it there and glided into the forest and was gone from my sight, permeating the air with a hideous stench. It took me a long while to compose myself after the critter finally left, and trembling I went over to a bush and vomited violently. How I managed to manoeuvre my body after that through the Sylvan back home, I don't even know, but I managed to get there. My husband describes me as being in a very strange, catatonic, contrived state when I returned home. He said that I was so dazed that I was spaced out and didn't say a thing for many hours. He sensed that I was clearly shocked by something and waited patiently for me to come out of my abstract delirium. Eventually my husband gave me a couple of shots of brandy, which I downed very gratefully. I then informed him what I'd witnessed in the Sylvan, and he listened intently, but I knew he didn't believe that I'd seen an ape-like humanoid. He kept telling me that I must have been mistaken, and it must have been a bear, which was exceedingly frustrating, for I knew what I saw. It was no bear, I insisted. It was a giant humanoid ape that was 9 foot tall and 900 pounds, with evil eyes and long shaggy hair. My words fell on deaf ears as my husband informed the sheriff that I had seen the local homeless vagrant killed by a bear in the Sylvan. When the police searched the area, there was no sign of the vagrant, whom had seemingly vanished into thin air, but they did find blood on the tree that I'd pointed out. Rumours abounded and circulated around our town that the local vagrant had been mauled and killed by a bear, but his body was never found nor recovered. It was only many years later that I was to discover that the creatures that I'd witnessed were Bigfoots. It was very strange that the smaller Bigfoot that had been pilfering koi from my pond never returned. He didn't strike me as evil like the critter that I observed killing the vagrant. If that was the case, I would never have followed those footsteps into the Sylvan. I have a gnawing feeling in my gut that he also was brutally murdered by that ghastly Bigfoot. I was informed by a friend of mine in the town that Diane had a trail camera installed near her pond, and she actually had footage of me creeping to her pond and hauling out her koi carp and pinching them. She said she'd seen the footage of me furtively looking around like a real criminal. My friend told me that Diane thought that I was so jealous of her pond that I wanted to steal her koi carp. I hasten to say that I just could not confess to Diane what I had done or why I had done it, because I was so embarrassed and humiliated. Indeed, so much so that I never even told my husband what I did. I couldn't bear the humiliation of him saying, "I told you so, I told you not to interfere." So even these days, wherever I see Diane, I tend to give her a wide berth, and she always looks at me with a look of, "I know what you did." So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.